The message arrived without warning, without context, and without any recognizable signature in the Citadel's vast communication grid. For a moment it existed only as a faint signal drifting across the relay network, another stray packet of corrupted data in a galaxy that processed trillions of transmissions every second. But when the patrol frigate on the far edge of Turian space attempted to decrypt it, the signal unfolded into something far stranger than a distress call, pirate broadcast, or diplomatic greeting. It was a legal notice. A perfectly formatted, meticulously structured legal notice stretching across hundreds of pages of bureaucratic jargon, stamped with seals from an interstellar authority that no record in the Citadel archives recognized. At the top of the document, written in precise and utterly indifferent language, were the words, "Official Notice of Galactic Demolition Authorization." Far beyond the borders of the Citadel Council space, where relay routes grew thin and the patrol grids were little more than distant sensor buoys and the occasional reconnaissance cruiser, the Turian frigate Vigilant Wing drifted silently above a lonely star system. Its crew had spent months chasing rumors of pirate raiders and smugglers slipping through poorly monitored relay routes. The patrol had been uneventful, monotonous even, the kind of assignment that slowly dulled the instincts of soldiers who had once served on the front lines of galactic conflict. Then the scanners lit up with something impossible. An object had appeared in deep space without activating a mass relay. It had not emitted a mass effect field flare. It had not followed any known FTL corridor. One moment the system was empty. The next moment an entire fleet hung in the void like a cluster of metallic scars against the stars. The ships were unlike anything in the database of the Turian hierarchy. Their hulls were blocky and uneven, covered in strange antenna arrays and enormous cylindrical structures that looked less like weapons and more like industrial machinery. Long scaffolding arms extended from the sides of the largest vessels, ending in massive mechanical claws and glowing emitters designed not for combat but for construction or destruction on a planetary scale. Their formation was disorganized compared to the disciplined patterns of Turian fleets, yet there was an unsettling certainty to their positioning, as though every ship knew exactly where it belonged within some incomprehensible logistical plan. The Vigilant Wing transmitted a standard contact challenge, broadcasting identification requests and warnings that the unidentified vessels had entered territory under Citadel protection. For nearly 30 seconds there was no response. Then the alien fleet answered. Not with weapons fire. Not with diplomacy. With paperwork. The frigate's communication console exploded with incoming data packets, thousands of files arriving simultaneously. The ship's six struggled to catalog them as page after page of legal documentation poured into the system. The message headers referenced a governing body called the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council and included authorization codes, infrastructure schematics, and something labeled, Approved Demolition Corridor 7B. At the center of the documents was a statement that chilled the crew more effectively than any threat could have. The entire region of space containing the mass relay network had been officially scheduled for removal in order to make room for a hyperspace bypass. The officer on the bridge blinked at the screen, convinced the translation software had malfunctioned. But the message repeated itself in dozens of languages simultaneously, including a perfectly accurate Turian translation. Attached to the notice was a small paragraph explaining that the inhabitants of the affected star systems had been given ample time to relocate. The fact that none of them had done so was described as a regrettable but legally insignificant oversight. Moments later, another transmission arrived. This one included an audio file. The ship's speakers activated automatically. What followed was the most painful 3 minutes the crew had ever experienced. It was poetry. Not elegant poetry. Not cultural poetry meant to convey meaning or beauty. This was something far worse, an agonizing recital delivered in a monotone alien voice, a rambling collection of metaphors, bureaucratic terminology, and grammatical atrocities that seemed almost deliberately designed to cause psychological distress. Several members of the crew physically recoiled. One technician actually muted the speakers after 30 seconds, claiming the sound felt like someone grinding metal directly against his nervous system. The message ended with a polite note thanking the recipients for their attention and reminding them that demolition operations would begin shortly. On the flagship of the approaching fleet stood the beings responsible for the transmission, the Vogons. They were tall, unpleasant creatures with thick green skin, heavy brows, and expressions that suggested a permanent state of bureaucratic irritation. To the Vogons, the situation unfolding in the Mass Effect galaxy was not an invasion. It was a routine infrastructure project. Their fleet had been assigned a task by the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council to construct a new intergalactic transit corridor connecting several distant sectors of the universe. Unfortunately, the projected route passed directly through a dense cluster of inhabited star systems connected by something called mass relays. The presence of billions of sentient beings was inconvenient, but not unprecedented. After all, the paperwork had been properly filed. Back on the Vigilant Wing, the Turian captain had already made his decision. Whatever these aliens believed they were authorized to do, they had just entered Council territory with a fleet large enough to threaten entire colonies. That alone was justification for a defensive response. The frigate's targeting systems locked onto the nearest unidentified vessel. Turian naval doctrine was clear: establish dominance early before an unknown enemy could organize. Fire! The frigate's main gun discharged with a thunderous recoil, launching a tungsten slug down the magnetic rails of its mass accelerator cannon. The projectile crossed the vacuum at terrifying speed, striking the alien ship with enough kinetic force to shatter a city. Except it didn't. The slug collided with the strange vessel's hull and detonated in a burst of sparks and debris, but the alien ship barely moved. The impact left only a shallow crater across a layer of thick industrial plating. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the Vogon fleet responded. Not with panic. Not with confusion. With procedure. The flagship transmitted another message to the Turian vessel acknowledging the attack and informing them that interference with authorized demolition operations constituted a violation of intergalactic infrastructure regulations. The notice politely explained that continued obstruction would result in enforcement measures. The captain of the Vigilant Wing didn't wait to read the rest. Full power to weapons. The frigate fired again, this time unleashing every gun it possessed. Kinetic rounds hammered against the nearest Vogon cruiser, followed by a barrage of missiles that erupted into a storm of explosions across the alien ship's hull. This time the Vogons reacted. One of the massive cylindrical structures attached to the alien vessel rotated slowly toward the Turian frigate. For a moment it looked almost harmless, like a piece of construction equipment adjusting position. Then the weapon activated. A beam of brilliant white energy lanced across the void, striking the Vigilant Wing with overwhelming force. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The beam did not simply pierce the ship's shields, it tore through them as though they barely existed, carving a glowing line across the frigate's midsection. The vessel's hull ruptured. Internal compartments exploded. Within seconds the proud Turian patrol ship was nothing more than a drifting cloud of molten debris. The Vogon fleet did not celebrate. They did not pursue the wreckage. They simply logged the incident in their operational records as a minor obstruction removed during the early phase of demolition preparation. Hours later, automated distress signals from the destroyed frigate finally reached a relay station deeper in Citadel space. The report was chaotic, fragmented, and almost impossible to believe. It spoke of unknown ships appearing without relays, strange industrial weapons capable of obliterating warships instantly, and a legal document claiming the entire galaxy had been scheduled for destruction. At the Citadel, the report was initially dismissed as sensor malfunction. But the messages kept coming. Across the outer colonies, long-range telescopes began detecting enormous fleets moving through deep space. Worlds near the edge of the relay network reported seeing unfamiliar starships constructing massive structures in orbit, structures that looked disturbingly similar to planetary mining equipment. Within days, entire outposts vanished from the map. By the time the Citadel Council began to take the situation seriously, the strange fleet had already begun its work. Somewhere beyond the relay network, demolition operations had officially begun. And the galaxy had no idea what it was about to face. If you want to see more characters enter the Mass Effect galaxy and collide with entire civilizations in stories like this, Hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see invade the galaxy in the comments below. Because this was only the beginning. The bureaucrats of destruction had arrived. And to them, the extinction of a galaxy was nothing more than an item on a completed checklist. The first official meeting of the Citadel Council emergency chamber began in silence that felt heavier than any war declaration in modern galactic history. For centuries, the Council had governed the largest interstellar alliance in known space, managing disputes between species, regulating the mass relay network, and preventing conflicts from escalating into galaxy-wide catastrophes. The systems they oversaw were home to trillions of lives spread across hundreds of star systems. They had survived pirate empires, political crises, and even the devastating war against the Reapers, ancient machine gods whose arrival had nearly wiped out every advanced civilization in the galaxy. Yet even after that nightmare, the data now appearing across the holographic displays inside the council chamber felt unreal. Entire frontier colonies had simply vanished. The projections showed sensor logs from 3 different relay sectors. In each case, automated stations reported the same impossible sequence of events. A massive fleet appeared in deep space without using a relay. The ships deployed enormous construction devices. Planetary crust readings spiked with energy signatures far beyond the output of any Citadel-recognized weapon system. Then the planets themselves stopped existing. Not shattered like asteroids or burned away by stellar bombardment, but cleanly dismantled, layer by layer, as if some unimaginable industrial machine had peeled them apart and removed the pieces. Standing at the center of the chamber was Admiral Valen of the Turian hierarchy. His rigid posture barely concealed the fury simmering beneath his disciplined exterior. Turians valued order, military precision, and chain of command. They understood war better than most species in the galaxy. But war followed rules, strategic goals, territorial control, resource acquisition. The reports flooding in from the outer colonies described something entirely different. "These are not military strikes," Valen said, his voice echoing across the circular chamber. "No enemy fleet we have ever encountered behaves like this. They are not capturing territory. They are not attacking infrastructure. They are dismantling entire star systems." The Salarian counselor leaned forward, thin fingers tapping nervously against the console embedded in the chamber's railing. Salarians were famous for their analytical minds and rapid strategic thinking. Their scientists had built some of the most advanced technologies in the relay network, and their intelligence agencies could dismantle conspiracies before most governments even realized they existed. Yet even Salarian analysts were struggling to interpret the data. "Our science teams have analyzed the transmissions intercepted by Turian patrol vessels," the counselor said quickly. "The language structure suggests a highly bureaucratic civilization. The documents appear to be legal declarations regarding demolition authorization. They repeatedly reference a governing body called the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council." A murmur rippled across the chamber. The asari counselor tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but thoughtful. Asari society had existed for thousands of years before humanity discovered the mass relays. Their species was known for patience, diplomacy, and an almost philosophical approach to galactic politics. But even she could not hide the concern in her voice. "You are suggesting," she said slowly, "that these aliens believe they have legal authority to destroy inhabited star systems?" "That is exactly what the documents claim," the Salarian replied. "According to the transmissions, our galaxy is scheduled to be cleared to make way for a hyperspace transit corridor." For a moment no one spoke. The human counselor finally broke the silence. Humanity had only joined the Citadel Council decades earlier, but their species had already developed a reputation for adaptability and bold action. Humanity's rise had been accelerated by heroes like Commander Shepard, whose actions during the Reaper War had saved countless civilizations. Now humanity once again found itself confronting the unknown. "You're telling us someone filed paperwork declaring the entire relay network obsolete," the human counselor said, disbelief edging his tone, "and now they're demolishing planets because of it?" "That appears to be the case." Another projection appeared above the chamber floor, displaying images captured by deep space observation probes. The ships responsible for the destruction were enormous, industrial monsters bristling with massive mechanical arms and glowing excavation beams. They bore little resemblance to warships built by Citadel species. Instead of sleek combat designs, their structures resembled mobile construction platforms. And at the center of the formation were the beings responsible for the operation, the Vogons. The image zoomed in on one of the creatures standing inside a command chamber filled with blinking consoles and stacks of digital documents. The alien's thick green skin and heavy facial features gave it an almost perpetually annoyed expression. It looked less like a conqueror and more like an overworked administrator. "They don't appear particularly warlike," the human counselor said cautiously. "That does not make them harmless," Admiral Vallon replied immediately. "Our patrol frigate engaged one of their ships. It was destroyed in seconds." Another display activated, showing the last recorded battle data from the doomed Turian vessel Vigilant Wing. The footage revealed the alien fleet's weapon systems activating, immense demolition beams capable of slicing through cruiser-grade armor like paper. The Salarian counselor's eyes widened. That energy output exceeds the maximum yield of the Nyx cannon by a factor of 6. The chamber fell silent again. That meant the alien fleet possessed weapons capable of destroying Dreadnought-class vessels without difficulty. Outside the council chamber, news of the crisis was already spreading across the Citadel. Military fleets were mobilizing. Civilian shipping routes were shutting down. Intelligence agencies were scrambling to analyze the alien transmissions. Every government in the relay network demanded answers. But the most disturbing discovery arrived an hour later. A new transmission from the Vogon fleet appeared simultaneously across dozens of communication channels throughout the galaxy. The message was not a threat. It was another notice. This time the document included a detailed schedule of upcoming demolition operations. Entire star clusters were listed in alphabetical order, each accompanied by a projected removal date. At the bottom of the document was a footnote politely reminding local inhabitants that complaints could be filed through the proper intergalactic administrative channels. The process required submission of a 17 million-page appeal form. Processing time was estimated at 900 years. The message concluded with another audio file. Across the Citadel, across Turian military command centers, across asari research institutes and human colonial governments, the galaxy was forced to listen as a Vogon recited another poem. The reaction was immediate. Several communication officers physically removed their headsets. Medical teams later reported mild neurological stress in listeners exposed to the entire recording. One asari linguist described the experience as a deliberate assault on the concept of language itself. But the most terrifying revelation was not the poetry. It was the fleet movements detected immediately afterward. Sensor networks confirmed that the Vogon Armada was expanding its operations across multiple sectors simultaneously. Construction ships began assembling enormous hyperspace infrastructure components around the ruins of destroyed planets. These devices appeared to be the first stages of a massive interstellar corridor project. The galaxy was not under attack. It was being redeveloped. Within the hour, the Citadel Council issued its first official directive. All Citadel fleets were ordered to intercept and halt the Vogon demolition fleet by any means necessary. Across the relay network, warships began mobilizing. Turian dreadnoughts launched from military shipyards. Human carrier groups deployed fighter squadrons. Salarian reconnaissance ships raced ahead to gather intelligence. Asari command vessels prepared powerful biotic commando units. For the first time since the Reaper War, the combined military power of the Citadel species began assembling for full-scale galactic conflict. Yet even as fleets moved into position, one question haunted every strategist studying the alien transmissions. What kind of civilization would treat the destruction of a galaxy as routine paperwork? And more importantly, how do you stop an enemy that believes it already has legal permission to erase you? Across the mass relay network, the first coordinated military response to the Vogon incursion formed with a speed that had not been seen since the darkest days of the war against the Reapers. Fleets that once fought side by side during that existential conflict now rallied again, their commanders remembering all too well what happened when the galaxy hesitated against an unknown enemy. The difference this time was that the threat was not ancient machines harvesting civilization for incomprehensible cycles. It was a bureaucratic civilization that believed entire star systems were merely construction sites awaiting demolition approval. The first defensive line formed near the relay corridor connecting the Arcturus sector to Citadel space. Human fleets led the forward staging operations, gathering at the massive orbital installations surrounding the system once commanded by Systems Alliance leadership. Shipyards that had spent years transitioning to peacetime production were suddenly pushed back into wartime output. Frigates rolled from assembly lines alongside heavy cruisers, their hull plating still warm from the forges when they launched toward the front lines. Admiral Hackett stood at the central tactical display aboard the command dreadnought stationed near the relay. The veteran officer had overseen the galaxy's last Great War and had hoped never to face another crisis of similar scale. Yet the sensor feeds filling the projection chamber told him that the situation unfolding across the outer systems might surpass anything they had faced before. Entire planetary bodies were being dismantled by alien fleets that did not appear interested in negotiation, conquest, or diplomacy. Their only communication had been demolition notices and poetry so terrible that medical teams were recommending controlled exposure protocols for anyone forced to listen to it. The holographic map displayed several blinking red markers expanding outward from the systems already destroyed. Each represented a Vogon industrial formation moving deeper into mass relay territory. Unlike conventional fleets, these armadas did not follow predictable military routes. They traveled slowly but relentlessly, deploying massive construction platforms before beginning the disassembly of targeted planets. Hackett crossed his arms and studied the display. "They're not scouting," he said quietly. "They're following a blueprint." One of the intelligence officers nodded grimly. "The intercepted transmissions confirm it, Admiral. Their fleets are working from something called a hyperspace transit corridor expansion map. Every system they're targeting lies along a straight route between two major stellar clusters. In other words, the Vogons were not invading. They were building a highway." The Turian hierarchy had no intention of allowing that construction project to continue. On the far side of the relay network, one of the largest military formations in Citadel history assembled under the authority of the Turian hierarchy. Turian fleets were renowned for discipline and firepower, and their dreadnought formations were designed specifically to break enemy armadas through overwhelming force. 3 of those fleets now converged on the outer systems where the Vogon construction ships had begun dismantling another inhabited planet. The system itself had once been a modest agricultural colony inhabited primarily by humans and asari settlers. Evacuation ships were still fleeing the orbiting debris field when the Turian armada arrived. Massive warships emerged from the relay corridor in tight formation, their hulls glowing faintly as weapon systems powered up. From the command bridge of the dreadnought Resolute Claw, Primarch Adrian Victus studied the sensor data with growing disbelief. The Vogon fleet surrounding the planet did not react like a military force encountering an approaching enemy. They continued operating their enormous demolition beams as if the incoming armada were irrelevant background noise. Construction vessels maneuvered slowly around the planet's surface, disassembling entire continental plates while automated drones collected the fragments. "Have they responded to hails?" Victus asked. "No, Primarch," the communications officer replied. "They acknowledged receipt of our transmission but replied with a document requesting proper demolition protest forms." The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances. Victus narrowed his eyes. "Very well. Open fire." The Turian fleet unleashed its first volley with devastating precision. The Nyx cannons, reverse-engineered from Reaper technology after the war, fired concentrated streams of superheated plasma across the void. The barrage struck the nearest Vogon construction vessel with enough force to destroy most known cruiser-class ships. The alien vessel did not explode. Instead, a massive energy field flared across its hull, absorbing the impact with minimal visible damage. Moments later, the Vogon fleet responded. Massive demolition emitters swung toward the Turian formation, and beams of blinding white energy lanced through space. One of the leading Turian cruisers vanished instantly, its armor vaporized before its kinetic barriers could compensate. Another ship was sliced nearly in half, the wreckage drifting apart as emergency beacons flickered helplessly in the void. The bridge of the Resolute Claw erupted with alarm signals. Victus stared at the tactical display as 3 more ships were destroyed within seconds. "This isn't construction equipment," one officer whispered. Victus clenched his mandibles. "Adjust formation. Concentrate fire on their command vessels." The battle escalated immediately. Turian dreadnoughts unleashed coordinated barrages designed to overwhelm even the strongest defensive barriers. Dozens of missiles streaked toward the alien fleet while fighter squadrons launched from carrier bays, their pilots weaving through debris fields as they attempted to reach vulnerable points in the massive construction ships. For the first time since the battle began, the Vogon fleet altered its behavior. Several enormous vessels disengaged from planetary demolition operations and repositioned themselves between the planet and the attacking armada. Mechanical arms folded inward as weapon systems emerged from previously concealed compartments. The construction fleet was transforming into a war fleet. Across the battlefield, Turian pilots realized the terrifying truth: the Vogons had never considered the Citadel fleets a serious threat. They had simply been following procedure. Now the procedure had changed, and the Vogon response was escalating accordingly. Within minutes, the outer edges of the Turian formation were engulfed in brilliant explosions as demolition beams swept through the attacking ships. Entire wings of fighters vanished when a secondary weapon system activated, an array of automated defense turrets capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously. Yet the Turian military was not easily broken. Victus ordered his dreadnoughts forward despite the mounting casualties. Their massive guns continued firing in coordinated bursts, gradually forcing the Vogon fleet to redirect more of its ships away from the planetary demolition effort. For the first time, the alien construction crews began falling behind schedule. And that, strangely enough, triggered the Vogon's greatest concern. Inside the command vessel overseeing the operation, a senior Vogon supervisor studied the combat reports with deep irritation. The destruction of enemy ships was proceeding efficiently. Enough, but the interruption of the demolition timetable was unacceptable. Several of the supervisor's assistants nervously consulted enormous digital files filled with regulations governing hyperspace corridor construction. After a moment, one of them spoke. "Sir, Section 14B of the Intergalactic Infrastructure Protocol states that if demolition operations are delayed by hostile interference, escalation to full military response is permitted." The supervisor frowned thoughtfully. "Have the appropriate forms been filed?" "Yes, sir. All 27 of them." "Excellent." The supervisor pressed a control panel. Across the battlefield, dozens of additional Vogon vessels emerged from hyperspace, ships far larger than the original construction fleet. The Turian armada suddenly found itself facing reinforcements powerful enough to change the entire balance of the conflict. On the bridge of the Resolute Claw, Victus watched the new contacts appear on the tactical display. His mandibles tightened. "This is a construction company?" The answer was becoming painfully clear. The Vogons had not yet deployed their real fleet, and the war for the Mass Effect galaxy had only just begun. News of the battle in the outer colony spread through the relay network faster than any official report could contain it. Survivors of the engagement arrived in damaged ships, their hulls scarred by weapons that no Citadel fleet had encountered before. Emergency transmissions flooded military channels, civilian networks, and diplomatic circuits simultaneously, creating a wave of alarm that rippled across the entire galaxy. The threat was no longer theoretical. A force that believed planets could be demolished for infrastructure expansion had now proven it possessed the firepower to fight and defeat modern Citadel fleets. At the heart of galactic government, the chambers of the Citadel Council erupted into heated argument the moment the first battle recordings arrived. The massive circular room, normally a place of careful diplomacy and measured deliberation, was filled with raised voices and urgent projections of tactical data. Representatives of the Asari republics, the Salarian Union, and the Turian hierarchy studied the same impossible footage, alien ships shrugging off dreadnought volleys while dismantling planets with construction equipment. The Asari counselor leaned forward, her normally calm voice sharpened by concern. These vessels are not behaving like conquerors. They are behaving like engineers. Across the chamber, the Turian representative responded with barely restrained anger. Engineers who just destroyed an entire fleet. The Salarian counselor adjusted the holographic projection hovering above the central table. The image zoomed in on the Vogon construction ships, revealing the vast latticework of machinery covering their hulls. Massive articulated arms moved slowly through vacuum, guiding beams that sliced sections of planetary crust into manageable fragments. Technologically fascinating, the Salarian murmured, his tone thoughtful despite the grim implications. Demolition process appears extraordinarily efficient. Entire biosphere removed in less than 3 standard hours. The Turian counselor slammed a talon against the table. That biosphere contains 6 million civilians. The Salarian paused, nodding once. Statistically unfortunate. Silence settled briefly across the chamber as the magnitude of the crisis pressed down on every representative present. The galaxy had survived the apocalyptic threat of the Reapers only a few years earlier, and the scars of that war were still visible everywhere. Entire fleets were still being rebuilt. Worlds devastated during the conflict had barely begun to recover. Now a new force had appeared, one that treated inhabited planets as obstacles to be removed. The Asari counselor finally broke the silence. Have we established contact with these Vogons? A communications officer standing near the chamber entrance hesitated. We have attempted multiple diplomatic channels. Each time they respond with documentation requests. What kind of documentation? The officer swallowed. They require demolition appeal forms submitted at least 50 years prior to the scheduled destruction of any planetary body. For several seconds, no one spoke. The Salarian counselor blinked slowly. 50 years? Yes. The Turian representative leaned back in his chair with visible frustration. So their argument is that these systems were already scheduled for destruction, and we failed to file objections? That appears to be their legal position. The absurdity of the explanation did nothing to diminish the reality of the threat. Outside the Citadel, entire fleets were mobilizing again. Warships from dozens of species prepared for combat while intelligence agencies struggled to determine exactly how large the Vogon civilization might be. The most troubling answer came from long-range scans near the outer relay corridors. The Vogon construction fleet currently operating in Citadel space represented only a tiny fraction of their total presence. Far beyond the explored borders of the galaxy, enormous industrial armadas were moving steadily along predetermined routes. Each fleet appeared to be expanding a vast hyperspace corridor stretching between distant star clusters, an infrastructure project so large that the destruction of several dozen inhabited systems barely slowed its progress. Inside the command center of the Systems Alliance, Admiral Hackett studied the same intelligence reports with growing concern. The scale of the Vogon operation suggested something unprecedented in galactic history. This isn't a war of conquest, he said quietly to the officers gathered around the tactical display. No, sir, one analyst replied. It's a construction schedule. Hackett frowned. And we're standing in the middle of the project. The holographic map shifted, highlighting a straight line cutting across dozens of systems connected by mass relays. If the projections were correct, the Vogons intended to clear that corridor entirely. Every planet, asteroid belt, or station located along the route would be dismantled and removed. That corridor passed directly through the heart of Citadel civilization. Hackett crossed his arms. Contact the Turian hierarchy and the Asari republics. If we try to fight this separately, we'll lose. Within hours, the largest coalition fleet assembled since the Reaper War began forming near the strategic relay junction leading toward the next system scheduled for demolition. Human, Turian, Asari, and Salarian warships arrived in massive formations, their combined strength representing the most powerful military force currently available in the galaxy. Yet even as the fleet gathered, reports continued arriving from the front lines. The Vogons were not retreating. They were accelerating. In the system where the Turian fleet had been defeated, the alien construction ships had resumed their work almost immediately after the battle ended. The shattered remains of the colony world drifted through space in enormous chunks as automated processing vessels converted the debris into building materials. Within the command vessel overseeing the operation, a senior Vogon supervisor studied the progress reports with a deep frown etched across his broad, unpleasant face. The interruption caused by the Turian fleet had delayed demolition by nearly 14 minutes, an unacceptable deviation from the projected timeline. He turned toward a cluster of assistants who were nervously sorting through endless files of interstellar regulations. Have we filed the proper paperwork regarding hostile interference with authorized infrastructure development? Yes, sir, one assistant replied quickly. Forms 17G through 17L have all been submitted. And the complaint against local inhabitants for failure to relocate prior to scheduled demolition? Filed, sir. The supervisor nodded with grim satisfaction. Excellent. Then we may proceed with escalation. Across the bridge, enormous holographic charts displayed the next stage of the project. The hyperspace corridor being constructed by the Vogons was not merely a shipping lane. It was part of a much larger transit network designed to connect distant galaxies through a web of carefully engineered routes. The Mass Effect galaxy was simply in the way. With a slow, deliberate motion, the supervisor pressed a command key. Far beyond the relay network, additional Vogon fleets altered course. Construction armadas that had been operating quietly in remote regions began accelerating toward Citadel space, their engines burning with steady determination. Each fleet carried demolition equipment capable of dismantling entire planetary systems. Back near the relay corridor, the Coalition fleet finally reached its full strength. Hundreds of warships formed a defensive wall across the approach to the next inhabited system along the projected Vogon route. Fighters launched from carriers while dreadnoughts aligned their massive main cannons. Admiral Hackett stood on the bridge of the flagship, studying the tactical display as the alien construction fleet emerged from the relay. For a moment, the two armadas simply faced each other across the cold vacuum of space. The difference in philosophy between them was almost impossible to comprehend. One side fought to protect civilizations. The other simply wanted to finish its construction project. And neither intended to back down. The silence between the two fleets stretched across the cold vacuum like a held breath. Hundreds of warships from the Citadel Coalition formed an immense defensive wall around the relay corridor, their engines glowing softly against the distant starlight. Dreadnought cannons were charged. Fighter squadrons waited for launch commands. Every tactical display aboard the flagship showed the same reality. The galaxy's most powerful military alliance had gathered here to stop the advance of the alien demolition fleets. Across the void, the Vogon construction armada continued its slow, deliberate movement. The ships did not form battle formations the way Citadel fleets did. They did not maneuver aggressively or prepare for a traditional engagement. Instead, they arranged themselves in wide geometric patterns, positioning massive demolition vessels at precise intervals along the corridor where the next inhabited system lay waiting. To the Vogons, the fleet blocking their path was not an enemy force. It was an administrative complication. Inside the command chamber of the Coalition flagship, Admiral Hackett studied the sensor feed with growing tension. Tactical officers spoke quietly around him while analysts attempted to interpret the strange behavior of the alien vessels. "They're not locking weapons," one officer reported. "Neither were they when they destroyed the Turian fleet," another replied. Hackett crossed his arms. "Open a channel." A communications officer hesitated. "Sir, we've tried multiple times. They keep sending legal notices." "Try again." The transmission beam cut through the vacuum, broadcasting across every frequency the fleet possessed. For several seconds there was only static. Then a signal finally returned. The holographic screen at the front of the bridge flickered. A massive alien figure appeared, thick-bodied, heavy-faced, with the unmistakably unpleasant expression that defined the species known as the Vogons. Behind the creature stretched a cavernous control room filled with endless rows of data terminals and towering stacks of documentation. The Vogon cleared his throat with a sound like grinding metal. Attention, unauthorized military vessels obstructing infrastructure development. You are currently violating Intergalactic Construction Ordinance 847, B subsection 12. The bridge crew exchanged bewildered looks. Hackett stepped forward. This is Admiral Stephen Hackett of the Systems Alliance. You are entering sovereign space under the protection of the Citadel Council. You will halt your operation immediately. The Vogons stared at him with visible annoyance. That request has already been processed and denied. A holographic document appeared on the screen, thousands of lines long. Your species failed to submit a demolition objection within the legally mandated time frame. The deadline passed 50 years ago. Hackett's voice hardened. We've never heard of your demolition schedule. Failure to monitor intergalactic construction bulletins does not invalidate the permit. The Vogon turned to another console and continued speaking in a bored tone. This corridor is required for hyperspatial infrastructure connecting multiple galactic clusters. Your planets occupy the projected route. Demolition will proceed according to the approved timetable. Behind Hackett, a Turian officer whispered quietly. They're serious. The Admiral leaned forward. There are billions of civilians living in those systems. The Vogon sighed with visible irritation. That is precisely why the demolition notices were issued in advance. The transmission ended abruptly. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Hackett turned toward the tactical display. Well, he said quietly, I guess negotiations are finished. The coalition fleet began moving almost instantly. Dreadnought formations shifted into attack alignment while fighter squadrons launched from carrier bays in enormous waves. The strategy was simple: overwhelm the alien fleet before their construction equipment could be deployed again. Turian dreadnoughts fired first. Mass accelerator cannons unleashed devastating streams of tungsten slugs traveling at relativistic speed. The projectiles slammed into the leading Vogon vessels with explosive force, lighting up the darkness of space with bursts of brilliant energy. For a moment it looked like the plan might work. Then the Vogon fleet responded. Unlike Citadel warships, the construction vessels carried no traditional weapon batteries. Instead, enormous mechanical arms extended from their hulls, each tipped with massive demolition tools designed for planetary excavation. One of those tools fired. A beam of concentrated energy cut through space with terrifying precision. The beam struck a Turian dreadnought directly along its central spine. For a fraction of a second the massive warship remained intact. Then the beam sliced completely through the vessel. The dreadnought split into two burning halves. Shock rippled through the coalition fleet. More beams fired. Entire squadrons of fighters vanished in flashes of blinding light as the construction lasers swept across the battlefield. Massive gravitic clamps normally used for moving planetary fragments locked onto approaching cruisers and hurled them violently aside. The Vogons were not trained soldiers, but their equipment was designed to dismantle planets. Against warships, the effect was catastrophic. Hackett gripped the railing of the tactical platform as casualty reports began flooding in. Keep the pressure on, he ordered. Don't give them time to deploy their full machinery. But the alien fleet showed no signs of panic. Instead, additional ships began emerging from the relay. Huge cargo vessels arrived carrying modular demolition platforms the size of cities. These structures unfolded slowly in the vacuum, forming enormous arrays of cutting beams aimed directly toward the inhabited world deeper inside the system. The colony planet rotated peacefully below, its oceans and continents glowing softly under the system's yellow star. Millions of civilians still lived there. If the demolition platforms activated, the world would be dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but drifting debris. Hackett turned to his communications officer. Signal the evacuation fleet. Within minutes, hundreds of civilian transports began fleeing the planet's surface, launching in chaotic waves as emergency sirens echoed across the cities below. The sky filled with rising ships as terrified populations attempted to escape before the demolition process began. But the Vogons continued working with mechanical precision. Construction drones moved into position around the planet's orbital path. Massive beam projectors aligned slowly, calculating the most efficient method of dismantling the world's crust. The battle above them intensified. Turian cruisers performed high-speed attack runs against the demolition platforms while asari frigates unleashed powerful biotic-enhanced weapon strikes designed to destabilize the alien machinery. Human dreadnoughts fired continuously, hammering the Vogon fleet with everything they had. For the first time since arriving in the galaxy, the Vogons experienced a genuine delay. The coalition attack was not stopping them, but it was slowing them down. Inside the primary Vogon command vessel, the senior supervisor studied the situation with growing irritation. The interference from local inhabitants had now delayed the construction schedule by nearly 40 minutes. That was unacceptable. He turned toward his subordinates. Prepare escalation procedures. Yes, supervisor. A new holographic display activated, revealing distant signals approaching through dark space far beyond the relay corridor. Additional Vogon fleets. Entire armadas of construction ships were accelerating towards Citadel territory, summoned to ensure the hyperspace corridor could be completed on schedule regardless of resistance. Back on the coalition flagship, long-range scanners detected the incoming signals. The tactical officer's voice carried quiet disbelief. Admiral, we're picking up dozens of new contacts. Hackett looked up. How many? The officer swallowed. Too many. The display zoomed outward, revealing the full scale of the incoming armada. Hundreds of additional demolition ships were on their way. The coalition fleet was fighting desperately to stop a single construction group. But the Vogon project was far larger than anyone had imagined. And the reinforcements were already coming. The first confirmation came from the long-range relay arrays orbiting the edge of Citadel space. Signals began arriving faster than analysts could process them, each one describing the same impossible situation unfolding across dozens of distant star systems. Massive alien fleets were emerging from deep space corridors that had never been charted before. Entire armadas of construction vessels were advancing methodically through the darkness between galaxies, their slow trajectories perfectly aligned with the Vogon demolition plans that had already been announced to the Citadel Council. What had initially appeared to be a single invasion fleet was now revealed as something far larger. This was a construction project on a galactic scale. Inside the Citadel Council chamber, emergency lights glowed dimly as representatives from the major species gathered for the most critical meeting in the station's history. The room, normally filled with political debates and diplomatic arguments, had transformed into a war command center. Holographic maps floated above the central platform, showing dozens of red markers slowly advancing toward populated regions of the galaxy. Each marker represented a Vogon fleet. The asari counselor studied the map with controlled calm, though the tension in her voice was impossible to hide. We are looking at a coordinated incursion across multiple relay routes. The Turian Primarch stood beside her, armored and grim. They are not attacking military targets. They're targeting entire star systems. The human representative from the Systems Alliance leaned forward slightly. They're building something, he said quietly. A new transmission appeared above the council chamber. The familiar, unpleasant face of a Vogon supervisor flickered into view, surrounded by rows of endless bureaucratic terminals. This one looked even more irritated than the previous official who had delivered the demolition notice. Attention local administrative authorities, the alien said in its gravelly monotone. Your continued interference with scheduled infrastructure development has resulted in significant delays to our operations. This is unacceptable. The Turian Primarch responded immediately. You are dismantling inhabited planets. Yes. You are destroying civilizations. Yes. The Vogon leaned forward slightly. But we are doing so legally. A massive document appeared in the hologram between them. Page after page of incomprehensible legal code scrolled across the display. Your region of space lies along the optimal route for the new hyperspatial bypass connecting the Sagittarius cluster with the Andromeda commercial corridor. The asari counselor spoke carefully. You are attempting to construct a highway through our galaxy. Correct. The alien's expression remained completely indifferent. Your worlds are located in the path of that development. Their demolition was approved under Intergalactic Construction Regulation 992-C. The human representative shook his head slowly. There are trillions of people living here. Yes. Then your project is impossible. The Vogon sighed deeply, as if exhausted by the entire conversation. On the contrary, it is merely delayed. The hologram shifted again. A larger map appeared, showing the Vogon fleet movements across Citadel territory. Hundreds of construction vessels were converging on key relay junctions, each one positioned to dismantle entire planetary systems and clear a path through the galaxy. The Primarch stared at the display. You're planning to cut a corridor through half the galaxy. That is the most efficient route. The Vogon tapped a terminal beside him. Your civilizations were notified centuries ago. Objections should have been submitted during the planning phase. The Asari counselor's voice hardened. We never received your notification. That is unfortunate. The alien shrugged slightly. Demolition will proceed regardless. The transmission ended without warning. Silence fell across the chamber. Then the Primarch turned toward the council members. We cannot fight this many fleets at once. The human representative nodded grimly. They're treating us like wildlife living in the path of a construction site. For the first time, the Asari counselor allowed genuine concern to show on her face. They aren't trying to conquer us. They're ignoring us. And that realization was even more terrifying, because it meant the Vogons had no reason to negotiate, no reason to surrender, and no reason to stop. Far from the Citadel, the battle near the relay corridor had become a desperate struggle for survival. The coalition fleet was losing ships faster than they could organize defensive formations. The Vogon demolition lasers carved through dreadnought armor with horrifying ease, while massive construction claws ripped apart smaller vessels that ventured too close. Yet the Citadel forces refused to retreat. They were buying time. Below the battlefield, the evacuation of the colony world continued at a frantic pace. Thousands of transport ships were lifting off from the planet's surface, carrying refugees away from the approaching demolition platforms. From orbit, the planet looked peaceful. Blue oceans shimmered beneath drifting clouds while the golden light of the system's star illuminated sprawling continents filled with cities. But above that fragile world, enormous Vogon machines were preparing to dismantle it piece by piece. Inside one of the largest construction ships, a Vogon operations manager reviewed the updated timeline for planetary demolition. The delay caused by local military resistance had already forced several adjustments to the schedule. That meant additional paperwork, which meant additional irritation. The alien turned to a nearby subordinate. Has the formal complaint regarding these military interruptions been filed? Yes, Supervisor. Good. The manager nodded with satisfaction. Then he activated the demolition sequence. Outside the ship, massive beams of energy ignited along the edges of the orbital platform. Each beam extended toward the planet below, forming a glowing lattice across the upper atmosphere. These beams were not weapons. They were cutting tools, designed to slice apart continents. The first beam touched the planet's crust. Across the surface, mountains split open as molten rock erupted into the sky. Entire tectonic plates began to fracture under the unimaginable energy of the demolition array. Cities disappeared in seconds. Oceans boiled. The planet screamed in silence as the machines began dismantling it layer by layer. Above the world, the coalition fleet watched in horror. Admiral Hackett stood motionless on the bridge of his flagship as the tactical display showed the planet breaking apart beneath the cutting beams. "We're too late," someone whispered. Hackett clenched his fists. "Not yet." He turned toward the communications officer. "Send a priority signal to the Citadel." "What message, sir?" The admiral stared at the burning world below. "Tell them this isn't an invasion." He paused. "It's a demolition. And unless the galaxy found a way to stop it, the Vogons would dismantle everything in their path. One planet at a time." Shockwaves from the planet's destruction rippled through the battlefield like the dying breath of a wounded giant. What had once been a thriving colony world now hung in orbit as a slowly expanding cloud of molten fragments and glowing debris. Vast pieces of continental crust drifted through space while boiling oceans vaporized into immense spirals of steam that briefly glimmered in the light of the system's star before fading into darkness. On the command deck of the system's Alliance dreadnought Resolute, silence gripped every officer watching the tactical displays. A planet had just been dismantled. Not conquered, not bombarded. Dismantled. Admiral Hackett stood at the center of the bridge, staring at the slowly dispersing remains of the colony world. Even in a galaxy that had witnessed the horrors of the Reaper War, the sight carried a chilling new implication. The enemy they faced did not view planets as homes. They viewed them as obstacles. A communications officer finally broke the silence. Admiral, evacuation ships are clear of the debris field. Refugee transports are jumping through the relay now. Hackett nodded once. At least we saved some of them. But the tactical officer shook his head grimly. Sir, long-range sensors are detecting another Vogon fleet entering the system. The holographic star map shifted as dozens of new red icons appeared beyond the outer orbit. They were not warships. They were construction vessels. Massive ones. The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances. Because the Vogons weren't retreating after the demolition. They were continuing the project. Hackett's voice turned cold. They're preparing to remove the asteroid belt next. Across the battlefield, enormous mechanical frameworks began unfolding from the Vogon platforms. Thousands of metallic arms extended outward like skeletal fingers reaching into the vacuum, each one tipped with gravitic anchors designed to latch onto asteroids and drag them into position. The goal was becoming horrifyingly clear. The Vogons weren't just destroying planets. They were restructuring entire star systems to clear a perfectly straight corridor through the galaxy. Inside the massive bureaucratic command vessel overseeing the operation, a senior Vogon infrastructure director reviewed the updated demolition progress. Several subordinates stood nearby, waiting nervously. The director tapped one of the glowing terminals. Planetary removal has been completed with acceptable efficiency despite local administrative interference. A subordinate coughed slightly. Supervisor, our fleet sustained minor damage from native military resistance. The director stared at him with dull irritation. Yes, I am aware. Another subordinate hesitated before speaking. The local authorities continued to insist their civilizations were not properly notified of the demolition schedule. The director leaned back slowly. They were notified. But the transmission logs appear to show. They were notified. The subordinate stopped speaking immediately. The Vogon tapped another terminal and opened a massive legal archive containing millions of construction permits. Notification of infrastructure development was posted in the appropriate bureaucratic channels. He scrolled through several entries before highlighting one obscure notice buried deep inside a subclause of intergalactic transport legislation. There. The document was over 400 pages long. The section containing the demolition notice consisted of 3 sentences. If the local inhabitants failed to read the documentation, that is not our responsibility. The subordinate nodded nervously. Of course, Supervisor. Outside the command vessel, the demolition fleets continued their work with mechanical precision. Gigantic gravitic beams locked onto asteroids and dragged them across space like floating pebbles. Entire fields of rock were rearranged into massive geometric patterns that slowly began forming the foundation of a colossal hyperspace corridor. What the Vogons were building wasn't merely a route through the galaxy. It was a permanent hyperspatial bypass designed to allow enormous intergalactic cargo fleets to travel across this region without navigating around dense star clusters. Efficiency, optimization, infrastructure. Those words meant nothing to the millions of refugees now fleeing the destruction of their homes. Back on the Citadel, the atmosphere had become tense enough to fracture diplomatic relations that had survived centuries of political conflict. Emergency sessions ran constantly as representatives from dozens of species argued over how to respond to a threat that seemed impossible to defeat. Inside the central chamber, the Asari counselors studied the latest battle reports. 3 planets destroyed in less than 12 hours. The Turian Primarch paced slowly across the floor. Our fleets can delay them, but we cannot stop them. The Salarian intelligence minister adjusted his datapad. There may be another option. Every eye turned toward him. The Salarian continued. Our research teams have been analyzing the Vogon communications network. And we've discovered something unusual. He activated a holographic display showing the internal structure of the Vogon bureaucratic hierarchy. Unlike most military forces, the Vogon fleet was not organized around strategic commanders or battlefield leaders. It was organized around administrators, inspectors, regulatory officers, permit coordinators. Entire divisions existed solely to verify that the demolition work complied with intergalactic infrastructure laws. The Salarian pointed to one specific node in the network. This individual appears to be responsible for approving the final demolition permits for each star system. The Turian frowned. You're suggesting we assassinate him? The Salarian shook his head. No. He zoomed in on the holographic display. We file an appeal. The room went silent. The Primarch blinked slowly. You want to fight an invasion with paperwork? The Salarian nodded. Exactly. The asari counselor tilted her head thoughtfully. You believe their bureaucratic structure can be exploited? Yes. He pointed to the massive chain of approval required before a Vogon demolition order could be legally executed. Every step requires documentation. Permits. Review boards. Inspection protocols. If we can overwhelm their system with legal challenges, procedural objections, and regulatory disputes. The Turian finally understood. We stall the entire project. The Salarian's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. Correct. Because the Vogons, for all their terrifying technological power, were slaves to their own bureaucracy. And bureaucracy could always be slowed. Back in the battlefield system, Admiral Hackett watched as the Vogon fleets continued constructing their hyperspace corridor through the shattered remains of the destroyed planet. But this time, something unexpected happened. A new transmission appeared across the Vogon command network. At first the message seemed insignificant. Just another administrative document. But then another appeared. And another. Within minutes, hundreds of legal challenges began flooding the Vogon administrative channels. Each one referenced obscure intergalactic infrastructure laws, environmental preservation clauses, historical protection regulations, endangered biosphere statutes. Some documents demanded formal inspections. Others demanded review panels. One particularly complex filing claimed the destroyed planet had been the nesting site of a rare migratory species that technically qualified as protected wildlife under several ancient galactic treaties. Inside the Vogon command vessel, the infrastructure director stared at the rapidly expanding notification list on his terminal. What is this? A subordinate stepped forward nervously. Supervisor, we are receiving thousands of legal objections to the demolition project. The director's eyes widened slightly. That is impossible. Another notification appeared. Then another. Soon the entire command network was buried beneath an avalanche of bureaucratic paperwork. Appeals. Reviews. Counter-appeals. Inspection requests. The Vogon director slowly clenched his massive fists. Because according to intergalactic construction law, every single one of those complaints had to be reviewed. And until the review process was complete, the demolition project could not legally continue. For the first time since arriving in the galaxy, the Vogon fleet hesitated. Not because of weapons. Not because of military resistance. But because of paperwork. And somewhere inside the Citadel, the Salarian intelligence teams began preparing the largest bureaucratic assault in galactic history. The Vogon demolition fleets drifted in uneasy stillness above the wreckage of the destroyed colony world, their vast construction frameworks suspended in space like unfinished monuments to bureaucratic ambition. Where moments earlier gravitic anchors had been tearing entire asteroid belts from their natural orbits, the machinery now remained locked in standby as administrative alerts continued to flood the command network. Inside the central Vogon infrastructure vessel, the air hummed with the low mechanical murmur of overloaded data processors. Endless columns of text scrolled across towering holographic displays as the system attempted to catalog the incoming avalanche of legal disputes. The infrastructure director stood rigidly before the main console, his massive brow furrowing deeper with every passing second. Report. A junior administrative officer nervously adjusted his datapad. Supervisor, the number of legal filings has exceeded 8 million and continues to rise. Another officer swallowed. Multiple galactic governments have submitted emergency injunctions requesting review of our demolition permits. The director turned slowly toward the wall-sized display showing the project's bureaucratic chain of authorization. Every demolition action required dozens of signatures and approvals, each one governed by ancient intergalactic construction laws dating back thousands of years. One of those approvals had just turned red. Then another. And another. Within minutes, entire sections of the approval network began flashing warning signals. The junior officer cleared his throat. Supervisor, several of the complaints cite environmental protection statutes requiring full ecological surveys before planetary demolition can proceed. Another officer added quietly. Others are requesting cultural heritage inspections to determine whether the demolished planets contained historically significant ruins. The director's voice dropped into a low growl. Those inspections would delay the project by decades. The officer nodded nervously. Yes, Supervisor. The Vogons stared at the console. For a species that treated bureaucracy as sacred law, ignoring proper procedure was unthinkable. Every infrastructure project in Vogon history had been governed by the same meticulous system of regulations and documentation. It was what made their civilization so efficient. But now that same system had become a trap. Across the galaxy, the Citadel's diplomatic chambers had transformed into something resembling a war room, though the weapons deployed were legal arguments rather than fleets. Representatives from dozens of species worked in frantic coordination, compiling every obscure law and regulation that might apply to the Vogon demolition project. The Salarian intelligence minister stood at the center of the room directing the effort. Focus on environmental preservation clauses first. A human legal advisor looked up from her terminal. We've already filed objections under 17 different biodiversity treaties. Good. A Turian strategist spoke next. Our historians have discovered that several of the targeted systems were mentioned in ancient Prothean navigation records. We can claim historical significance. The Salarian nodded approvingly. Excellent. File a cultural preservation injunction immediately. Nearby, Asari legal scholars worked through vast archives of interstellar law. Here's another one of them said. Article 42 of the Galactic Development Charter requires a full impact review for any project that alters a major trade route. Perfect, the Salarian replied. Submit it. Hundreds of documents launched into the extranet simultaneously, each one carefully formatted to match the Vogon bureaucratic protocols. Each one designed to slow them down. Back in the contested system, Admiral Hackett watched the unfolding situation from the bridge of the Resolute. The tactical displays still showed the overwhelming presence of the Vogon fleets, but their ships had stopped moving. Status. The communications officer looked up. Sir, our analysts confirm the Vogon construction operations have halted pending administrative review. Hackett allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. Never thought I'd see the day bureaucracy saved a planet. But the moment of relief was short-lived. A sensor technician suddenly spoke up. Admiral, we're detecting a new transmission from the Vogon flagship. Hackett's expression hardened. Put it through. The holographic display flickered as a towering Vogon figure appeared. His expression was even more unpleasant than the previous administrators the galaxy had encountered. Attention, unauthorized inhabitants of this construction zone. The voice rumbled through the bridge. Your recent submissions of legal documentation have been received and are currently undergoing bureaucratic evaluation. The Vogon paused. However, preliminary analysis indicates that many of these filings may constitute fraudulent obstruction of an approved infrastructure project. Hackett crossed his arms. Translation? The communications officer muttered. They're accusing us of paperwork sabotage. The Vogon continued speaking. In accordance with subsection 7 of the Intergalactic Administrative Integrity Act, intentional interference with lawful construction projects is punishable by immediate removal of obstructing parties. The bridge grew silent. The Vogon leaned closer to the transmission camera. Your civilizations have 3 standard hours to withdraw all legal objections. If you fail to comply, you will be classified as administrative obstacles. The transmission ended. The silence on the bridge felt heavier this time. One of the officers finally spoke. Administrative obstacles? Hackett exhaled slowly. That's Vogon for demolition target. On the Citadel, the same message echoed through the council chambers. The Turian Primarch slammed his fist against the table. They're threatening to destroy us for filing complaints? The Salarian intelligence minister tapped his datapad thoughtfully. That response confirms our strategy is working. The Asari counselor frowned. Working? They just threatened genocide. Yes. The Salarian looked up calmly. And they only make threats when they're losing control of the process. He activated a new holographic display. Our legal teams anticipated this possibility. The screen filled with additional documents. Thousands of them. Every time they attempt to invalidate one objection, 2 more appeals automatically trigger. The Turians stared at the display. You created a self-replicating legal system. The Salarian smiled faintly. Precisely. Because bureaucracy, once unleashed, had a tendency to multiply beyond control. And that was exactly what was happening inside the Vogon administrative network. Back in the Vogon flagship, alarms were beginning to sound across multiple departments. Supervisor. The infrastructure director turned toward the panicked officer. What is it? Our system cannot process the volume of incoming legal challenges. Another officer added urgently. Every time we reject one appeal, 2 more automatically activate through cross-referenced statutes. The director stared at the data streams flooding the network. The scale of the bureaucratic assault was staggering. Millions of documents. Millions more pending. Each one technically valid under some obscure section of galactic law. And every single one required review. The director clenched his massive fists. Redirect additional processors to the legal evaluation department. The officer hesitated. Supervisor, if we do that, the demolition systems will lose operational capacity. The director's voice became dangerously low. Do it. Throughout the vast Vogon fleet, construction machinery powered down as processing power shifted toward administrative analysis. The galaxy's most terrifying demolition force had been forced to stop, because its paperwork backlog had become larger than its weapons systems. Far away on the Citadel, the Salarian minister quietly observed the results. They're slowing. The Turian Primarch crossed his arms. For how long? The Salarian didn't answer immediately, because even he knew the truth. This wasn't a victory. It was a delay. Eventually the Vogons would process the paperwork. Eventually the demolition would resume. Unless the galaxy found another way to stop them. And somewhere deep within the Vogon fleet, a particularly unpleasant administrator was already beginning to draft a new solution, one that would bypass the legal obstacles entirely. If the local civilizations insisted on interfering with the project, then perhaps the project needed to remove the civilizations first. The moment the Vogon administrative network began drafting new procedural responses, the fragile equilibrium holding the galaxy together started to fracture. Across the contested systems, demolition fleets remained suspended in eerie stillness, but the silence carried a heavy, oppressive weight. Massive construction rigs loomed like skeletal cities in orbit, their gravitic anchors dimmed but not deactivated, ready to resume their devastating work the moment bureaucratic clearance returned. For the civilizations of the Mass Effect galaxy, the pause was not a victory but a narrow breath taken between storms. Every government understood that the Vogons were not retreating. They were recalculating. Within the Citadel's central governance chambers, The atmosphere had shifted from frantic improvisation to a tense, strategic urgency. Representatives from dozens of species remained locked in continuous coordination, their terminals glowing with endless streams of legal filings, counterfilings, and jurisdictional arguments. The original plan had been simple in concept but overwhelming in execution. Drown the Vogon administration beneath a tidal wave of procedural complications so vast that the demolition project would stall indefinitely. The strategy had worked, temporarily. Yet intelligence reports arriving from the front lines revealed that the Vogons were adapting faster than expected. Salarian analysts observed subtle changes in the way Vogon systems processed the legal challenges. Entire branches of administrative law were being reorganized. New review committees were forming within the Vogon command hierarchy, each designed to filter incoming objections more efficiently than the last. What had begun as an unstoppable avalanche of paperwork was gradually being carved into manageable streams. The Vogons had been caught off guard by the galaxy's sudden mastery of bureaucratic warfare, but they were not incapable of learning. Their civilization had been built on regulation and procedure for millennia. Now they were reshaping that system into a weapon of their own. The implications of that realization spread quickly among the Allied leadership. If the Vogons succeeded in restructuring their legal evaluation process, the delays currently protecting countless star systems would evaporate overnight. Entire worlds that had been granted temporary reprieve would once again appear on demolition schedules. The fragile coalition assembled on the Citadel understood that time was running out. Beyond the diplomatic chambers, the galaxy's military forces prepared for the possibility that diplomacy and legal maneuvering might ultimately fail. Turian fleets repositioned along key relay corridors, forming defensive lines intended to slow any sudden advance by Vogon construction armadas. Human Systems Alliance task groups moved quietly between colonies, evacuating civilian populations from systems that appeared most vulnerable. Salarian intelligence teams deployed deep into extranet infrastructure, searching for weaknesses within the Vogon data networks that might allow them to prolong the bureaucratic stalemate. Yet despite these preparations, a grim understanding lingered among every strategist studying the situation. Even the combined fleets of the Citadel races could not match the raw industrial power of the Vogon demolition armadas. Their ships were not built for combat in the traditional sense. They were built to dismantle planets. Their gravitic anchors could tear apart crusts, their mining arrays could shred asteroid belts into dust, and their infrastructure engines possessed energy outputs rivaling the weapons of entire battle groups. Direct confrontation would be catastrophic. What made the situation even more unsettling was the Vogons' perspective on the conflict. For them, the resistance of the Mass Effect civilizations was not seen as war. It was seen as interference. The distinction was subtle but terrifying. War implied an opponent worthy of consideration. Interference implied an obstacle to be removed. Deep within the largest Vogon command vessel, administrative councils were already debating the next procedural step. The scale of the legal opposition filed by the Citadel races had forced the demolition authority to escalate the matter to higher regulatory tiers. Entire departments dedicated to intergalactic compliance had been activated, and their analysts now sifted through the endless filings with cold, methodical precision. Every claim of ecological protection, every appeal to historical preservation statutes, every invocation of trade corridor regulations was evaluated according to ancient interstellar legal frameworks older than most civilizations in the galaxy. At first glance, the objections appeared legitimate. Many of the systems targeted by Vogon demolition fleets did indeed contain ecosystems of remarkable complexity. Some contained archaeological evidence of ancient cultures that predated the current Citadel cycle. Others were located along established hyperspace and mass relay trade routes whose disruption could destabilize entire economic networks. Under normal circumstances, such claims might have halted a project indefinitely. But the Vogons were not interested in normal circumstances. As their analysts reviewed the objections, a pattern began to emerge. Many of the legal filings referenced one another in complex chains of cross-authorization, forming what the Vogons quickly recognized as a deliberate procedural maze. The Citadel races had constructed a bureaucratic trap designed to keep the demolition project entangled in endless review cycles. From a purely administrative perspective, the tactic was almost admirable. It demonstrated a surprising understanding of Vogon regulatory culture. The civilizations of this galaxy had learned quickly how to weaponize procedure. But admiration did not change the outcome. One by one, Vogon legal processors began categorizing the objections under a specific clause buried deep within the Administrative Integrity Charter. The clause had been written centuries earlier to address sabotage attempts by rival infrastructure guilds. It defined a condition known as systemic obstruction, a coordinated effort to overwhelm lawful administrative processes in order to delay or disrupt approved projects. Once that classification was applied, the situation changed dramatically. Systemic obstruction carried its own set of legal remedies. Among them was a provision allowing the Demolition Authority to neutralize interfering entities if their actions threatened the completion of an authorized infrastructure project. Within the Vogon command network, a new document began circulating through the approval chain. Its language was brutally simple. If the civilizations filing objections were themselves the source of the obstruction, then removing those civilizations would restore administrative efficiency. To the Vogons, the logic was flawless. Back on the Citadel, the first signs of the impending escalation arrived through intercepted data fragments recovered by Salarian intelligence operatives. The fragments were incomplete, corrupted by unfamiliar encryption protocols, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. The Vogons were preparing to reinterpret the legal battlefield entirely. Instead of allowing the bureaucratic stalemate to continue, they were moving to redefine the Citadel races themselves as administrative obstacles. The realization spread through the command structure like a shockwave. What had begun as a clever legal strategy had inadvertently triggered a clause that justified direct removal of the protesting civilizations. Military leaders immediately recognized the implications. If the Vogons enacted the systemic obstruction ruling, their fleets would gain legal authorization, by their own regulatory standards, to dismantle any star system responsible for the paperwork interference. The scale of destruction that could follow was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire species could vanish not because of conquest or war, but because their legal filings had been deemed disruptive to a construction project. Despite the grim outlook, the galaxy refused to surrender to the inevitability of that outcome. New strategies were already taking shape within the Citadel's emergency councils. Some proposed launching covert infiltration operations into Vogon data networks to disrupt the classification process before the systemic obstruction ruling could be finalized. Others argued for direct negotiation, attempting to convince the Vogons that the legal disputes were legitimate rather than malicious. Still others suggested something far more radical, rewriting the battlefield entirely. If the Vogons insisted on treating the conflict as a matter of law rather than warfare, then the Citadel races would respond in kind. Entire teams of legal scholars, historians, and intelligence analysts began combing through the oldest records of interstellar law ever discovered. Their goal was simple but ambitious: find a regulation powerful enough to halt a Vogon demolition project completely. Somewhere within the labyrinth of ancient bureaucratic statutes, they believed there had to be a clause even the Vogons could not ignore. As the search intensified, fleets continued to hold their defensive positions across the threatened systems. The stars themselves seemed to watch silently as two civilizations, one built on governance and diplomacy, the other on regulation and demolition, fought a war that was being waged not with lasers and missiles, but with documentation and procedure. Yet beneath that bureaucratic battlefield, the tension of impending violence continued to grow. The Vogon fleets had not powered down their demolition engines. They had merely paused them. And every passing hour brought the galaxy closer to the moment when the paperwork would run out. Across the vast relay network of the galaxy, a strange and unsettling silence had begun to spread. Entire sectors that once buzzed with traffic from merchant convoys, patrol fleets, and civilian transports now sat under the looming shadow of Vogon demolition platforms that remained dormant but far from harmless. The pause imposed by bureaucratic review had bought time, but time itself had become the rarest resource the galaxy possessed. In the command chambers of the Citadel, leaders from every major civilization understood that the fragile stalemate could collapse at any moment, and if it did, the consequences would not be limited to a handful of contested systems. The Vogons had already demonstrated that their understanding of law included the authority to erase entire regions of space if those regions interfered with authorized projects. The intercepted intelligence revealing the systemic obstruction clause had transformed the political atmosphere overnight. What had once felt like a clever legal defense now carried the terrifying possibility of provoking the very annihilation it had tried to prevent. Salarian analysts worked continuously, dissecting the fragments of Vogon documentation they had managed to capture. Every line of alien legal language was examined with microscopic attention, searching for loopholes, contradictions, or procedural flaws that might delay the ruling long enough to shift the balance of power. Meanwhile, the Citadel's legal scholars began constructing something unprecedented in galactic history. Rather than simply defending against Vogon claims, they were assembling a massive interstellar counterpetition that challenged the legitimacy of the Vogon demolition authority itself. The argument was bold and dangerously ambitious. The Vogons had arrived in a galaxy governed by its own established legal frameworks, its own recognized sovereign territories, and its own ancient treaties. If the Vogons insisted on operating through law rather than warfare, then they would have to prove that their authority extended into a galaxy that had never recognized their jurisdiction. It was a gamble built on a fragile hope. The Citadel races were wagering that the Vogons' obsession with regulation would force them to acknowledge legal boundaries they had previously ignored. The proposal grew into an enormous legal construct spanning millions of pages. Every species contributed elements to the argument. The Asari submitted cultural preservation claims dating back thousands of years, asserting that numerous systems targeted for demolition contained irreplaceable artifacts of galactic heritage. The Turians built a case based on defense treaties, arguing that the presence of Vogon demolition fleets constituted an unauthorized military occupation under Citadel law. Human legal teams introduced trade and navigation agreements demonstrating that the threatened relay corridors served as critical arteries connecting the entire interstellar economy. Even smaller civilizations joined the effort. Volus trade guilds submitted economic impact analyses predicting the collapse of multiple financial sectors if demolition continued. Hanar philosophical orders presented theological declarations asserting that certain star systems were sacred manifestations of cosmic balance. Elcor historians contributed records describing ancient settlements that predated many of the galaxy's modern powers. Individually, none of these arguments could stop a Vogon project. But together they formed a structure so vast and interconnected that dismantling it would require the Vogons to examine every legal tradition the galaxy possessed. The final document was not merely a petition. It was a challenge. Once transmitted through the extranet toward the Vogon command network, it represented the combined will of an entire galaxy refusing to accept demolition as inevitable. The response came slowly, filtered through layers of translation and administrative review. For several days the Vogon fleets remained completely inactive while their internal systems processed the enormous legal construct that had been delivered into their bureaucratic machinery. Analysts on the Citadel watched the data streams with anxious fascination. Every moment the Vogons spent reviewing the counterpetition was another moment their demolition engines remained silent. Yet deep within the vast data structures of the Vogon command network, something unusual was unfolding. For the first time since their arrival in the galaxy, the Vogons were encountering a civilization capable of meeting them on their own battlefield. The Citadel races had not simply filed objections. They had constructed an entirely new regulatory environment that forced the Vogons to consider variables outside their original project parameters. Interstellar heritage law, sovereign territorial claims, multilateral treaties, and economic stabilization clauses were all tangled together into a web of legal logic that could not be dismissed without careful evaluation. The Vogons did not feel frustration in the way most organic beings did. But their administrative systems recognized complexity, and the complexity presented by the Citadel Coalition had reached extraordinary levels. Within their command hierarchy, The debate intensified. Some administrative councils argued that the systemic obstruction classification still applied. According to the letter of Vogon law, the overwhelming flood of documentation clearly constituted an attempt to interfere with authorized construction. Under that interpretation, the demolition authority retained full legal rights to remove the civilizations responsible. But other councils raised a different concern. If the Citadel Galaxy possessed its own functioning legal infrastructure recognized by multiple sovereign species, then the demolition project might technically fall under the jurisdiction of intergalactic regulatory negotiation. Proceeding without resolving those claims could violate ancient statutes governing cross-galactic infrastructure development. For the Vogons, violating administrative law was unthinkable. As the internal debate spread across their vast bureaucratic hierarchy, the demolition fleets remained motionless. Their engines hummed quietly, ready to resume their terrible work, yet held in suspension by the very rules that defined Vogon civilization. On the Citadel, the waiting became almost unbearable. Military commanders maintained defensive formations, fully aware that if the Vogons ultimately ruled against the counterpetition, the fleets poised across the galaxy would have no choice but to fight. Preparations continued in hidden shipyards and remote outposts. New alliances formed between species that had once viewed each other with suspicion. The threat posed by the Vogons had united the galaxy in ways few crises ever had. Days stretched into weeks. Then, finally, the Vogon command network transmitted its preliminary ruling. The demolition project would not resume immediately. Instead, it would enter a new phase of intergalactic regulatory arbitration. The announcement stunned observers across the galaxy. Rather than dismissing the Citadel Coalition's legal challenge, the Vogons had accepted that the situation required formal review under extended administrative procedures. The decision did not cancel the demolition project. It did not guarantee permanent safety for the threatened systems. But it forced the process into a labyrinth of bureaucratic evaluation that could take years, perhaps even decades, to resolve. For the first time since the Vogons had arrived, the civilizations of the Mass Effect galaxy understood that they had achieved something remarkable. They had not defeated the Vogons through military might. They had trapped them inside their own system of rules. The demolition fleets remained in orbit, silent monuments to a conflict that had transformed the nature of galactic survival. Instead of battles fought with weapons, the future of entire star systems now rested on legal arguments, historical claims, and procedural reviews unfolding across an alien administrative machine larger than any government the galaxy had ever known. For the Vogons, the situation was simply another project awaiting proper documentation. For the civilizations of the Mass Effect galaxy, it was proof that unity, ingenuity, and stubborn refusal to surrender could turn even the strangest enemy into something manageable. Yet everyone understood that the story was far from over. Because somewhere deep inside the endless filing systems of the Vogon bureaucracy, the demolition order still existed, waiting for the day the paperwork finally ran out. Long after the Vogon demolition fleets arrived, the galaxies of the Citadel races would remember the crisis not as a war, but as a revelation. The Vogons had come armed with machines capable of dismantling planets, yet their greatest weapon had never been those terrifying engines. It had been the cold, unyielding authority of their administrative law. Entire civilizations had nearly vanished not because they were weak, but because they had unknowingly stood in the path of a project already approved somewhere in an alien bureaucracy. Faced with that impossible threat, the species of the Mass Effect galaxy discovered something unexpected about themselves. Humans, turians, asari, salarians, and dozens of others had not simply fought back. They had adapted. They had learned to speak the language of their enemy, transforming diplomacy, law, and collective knowledge into shields strong enough to halt even a Vogon demolition order. The result was not victory in the traditional sense. The Vogons still existed, their fleets still hovered across contested systems, and their paperwork still crawled slowly through endless layers of review. But the galaxy had proven that it could survive even the strangest collision of civilizations. In the quiet corridors of the Citadel, Historians would later describe the crisis as the moment the galaxy realized that survival sometimes required more than strength. It required unity, creativity, and the willingness to challenge threats on entirely new terms. Somewhere beyond the relay network, Vogon clerks continued processing documents, reviewing petitions, and organizing the enormous archive of objections filed by the Citadel Coalition. The demolition project had not been cancelled. It had merely become part of an administrative debate that might last centuries. And for the civilizations of the Mass Effect galaxy, that was enough. Because as long as the paperwork continued, the stars themselves would remain safe.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if